Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be reviewing some books from the long list of the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. So if you don't know, every year I read along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. It's my favourite literary prize. I think it's a really great, interesting prize, and every year I find myself discovering new favourite books from it. The long list was announced a couple of weeks ago. I posted some predictions for the long list and then a video reacting to the long list itself, and I have got to work on reading the long list. I did actually read one book before the long list was announced, but I had a sneaking suspicion it might make the long list, which is one of the reasons why I read it in the first half of February. And then after the long list was released, I read another book from the long list in the second half of February, so I thought I would talk about those two today. I imagine as I start to read through more of the long list, I might do some videos where I'm reviewing 3 books rather than 2 together in one video, but I have quite a lot to say about both of these books, certainly at least about one of these books, so I thought I would review them both today. I'm really excited to read along with the Walter Scott Prize long list again this year, and I'm also excited that lots of you are excited about the prize. It was really nice reading the comments on my last 2 videos about the Walter Scott Prize, because I feel like when I started reading along with the Walter Scott Prize several years ago, the videos I made about it never got as many views and people weren't as excited, whereas I feel like now quite a lot of people are excited about the Walter Scott Prize, which is really nice. And it's also been quite nice. I've seen quite a few other people talking about it on Booktube more than previously. So Shelly Swearingen did a reaction to the long list. I'll leave her video linked down below, and also Jen the librarian and Dan at Uni and Books have also said they're gonna read along with lots of the long list, so I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on the books as well. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about Clear by Karis Davies and Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, both of which are brilliant books. I think I'm going to start with Clear because I think I have more to say about Glorious Exploits, partly because Glorious Exploits is a full-length novel and Clear is a novella. It's very short, so I'm sort of slightly limited in what I can say about it, but I thought both of these books were great, and very, very different novels, completely different books, so exciting to see them both on the long list and to have a chat about them today. So we'll start off with Clear. Very short, very succinct, very powerful. So Clear is, as I said, very short. So I think the physical book is 150 pages. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook is 3 hours long. So it's very, very short. And while it is a novella in length, it almost feels like a short story in its kind of tight, succinct structure. And there's something very, very powerful about the length of it. It just feels like exactly the length it should be. I almost feel like if this book had been in all other ways very similar but longer, I wouldn't have liked it as much, because it just felt perfect in its size and completeness. I feel like I've heard a lot of people over the last few years talk about how much they love Claire Keegan, and I read Small Things Like These and I thought it was really great. I had no faults to pick with that book. I thought it was perfectly formed for what it was, but it didn't grab my heart in the way that I think Claire Keegan books grab other people's hearts. But Clear is a very similar length, and in some ways kind of put me slightly in mind of Claire Keegan, and it grabbed my heart in a way that Small Things Like These didn't. And I feel like if you like Claire Keegan and you like those kind of very short, packing a punch books, then you might like Clear. I haven't even told you anything about what it is about. So Clear is set on a small Scottish island, somewhere between the Shetland Islands and Norway. I appreciate that if you're not from the UK, you might have no idea what the Shetland Islands are, so I'll put a map up on the screen so you can see the geography we're talking about here. And Clear is set on this small island on which one person lives, a man called Ivor. He has lived there for many years. All his family have gone. He is the last remaining inhabitant of this place, and his landlord no longer wants him to live there. His landlord wants to evict him from the island in order to have more grazing space for sheep. And the landlord employs a man called John Ferguson, who is a clergyman, and he has recently left the established church to join the Free Church of Scotland. And therefore he is in difficult circumstances, really needs money to help support him and his wife. And so he takes this commission from this landlord to travel to this island in order to evict Ivor. He arrives on this island and everything goes on from there, but not in the way way you would expect. Before I get talking about all the things I loved about Clear, I did want to read a bit from the author's note because I thought it was really interesting. I listened to the audiobook, and in general I thought the audiobook was fantastic, really well performed. But one thing the audiobook didn't have in it was the author's note, so I'm very grateful to the person who left a comment on my previous video about the Walter Scott Prize longlist and said that there was a really good author's note in the book, because I luckily managed to get the ebook out of my library as well and read the author's note on that. And I did find it really interesting to kind of hear about the context behind the book, both in terms of the sort of historical social context and also the kind of historical linguistic context of the book. Talk more about the way this book looks at language in a minute. In her author's note, Caris Davies talks about the historical context of the book, and especially how the book relates to the clearances. So the clearances took place in the 18th and 19th century, where large communities of the rural poor were evicted from their land, often land that their families and ancestors had lived on for generations, by wealthy landowners. I am from the UK and I'm half Scottish, but I didn't know anything about the clearances until last year, when I read another book that was on the Walter Scott Prize longlist, Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson, which also looked at the clearances. In general, I would say that like the way British history is taught in England, at least, probably in a lot of the UK, is very English focused. So it was really interesting to learn more about the clearances, and it's a topic I'm interested in learning more about. So anyway, let me read you a bit from the author's notes. The story I have imagined in Clear takes place in 1843, the year of the great disruption in the Scottish Church, where 474 ministers, roughly 1/3 of the total number, rebelled against the system of patronage, whereby Scotland's landowners had the power to install ministers of their choice in parishes on their estates. These rebellious ministers broke away to form the new Free Church, giving up their manses and their churches to start again from scratch. These are the circumstances in which my own John Ferguson finds himself, circumstances which bring him up against another of Scotland's great historical social upheavals, the clearances, which began in the lowlands in the mid-18th century and continued into the second half of the 19th century in the Highlands and Islands. Whole communities of the rural poor were forcibly removed from their homes by landowners in a relentless programme of coercive and systematic dispossession to make way for crops, cattle, and increasingly, as time went on, sheep. I think that gives you quite a good sense of the historical context of this book. There was so much that I loved about Clear. Like I said, I feel like it was just exactly the right length and was just a very like self-contained story that was really effective. I also just thought it was a really beautiful character study of three people. So we have Ivor, the man on the island, John Ferguson, the minister, and also John's wife Mary is an important character too. And while the two men are on the island, we're often kind of flashing back to see what Mary is doing back on the mainland. And I feel like the way these three characters are drawn and the way the character relationships are teased out throughout Clear was so well done, and really light touch, but in a very like clever, beautiful way. I especially loved Ivor, and I feel like he was drawn in such a clever and emotional way. When John Ferguson arrives on the island, Ivor has not seen another human being for years. He has lived a solitary life with the animals and crops that he tends to, but he hasn't seen another human being for a long time. And I feel like the way this book looks at loneliness through Ivor, but also through the other characters too, was so just beautiful, sad in some ways, but also just like so poignantly created. This book also has a lot of fascinating things to say about language. So Ivor doesn't speak either English or Scots. He speaks another language that hardly anyone speaks, that he is possibly one of the last people to speak. So in Caris Davies' author's note, she talks about how she was inspired to create Ivor's language by a dictionary she found from the early 20th century called the Etymological Dictionary of the Norn Language in Shetland. So Norn was a language that was historically spoken in Orkney and Shetland, but had died out or was nearly extinct by sort of mid-19th century. So Ivor's language is not Norn, it's not the same, but it is inspired by that. And Caris Davies has created this whole language and all of these words that Ivor uses, and Ivor ends up teaching some of these words to John Ferguson so that they can communicate. The use of language was really, really interesting, especially because Ivor's language is like very specific. So there's a lot of times where Ivor has a word for something, and John would only have one word for 5 words that either has, if that makes sense. And I thought that stuff was really interesting, especially, you know, the book is called Clear, and clear is about many things and, you know, the clarity of your thoughts. But I also feel like it's to do with expressing yourself to other people, how hard it can be to be clear, but also those moments of clarity you do get. And I thought that stuff was really, really interestingly explored. There are a lot of other interesting themes delved into in Clear. One theme in particular that I thought was like really well and poignantly explored, but I can't really talk about that because it would definitely be a spoiler, and the book is so short. Like, I just feel like you should just read it without knowing too much about it. I say, having spoken to you about it for 5 minutes or whatever, probably more, but I just thought it was really, really well done. Short but packs a punch, really powerful. I loved the ending, and I thought that was done really well. The character relationships and the sort of look at 3 very different people at this point in Scottish history where lots of things are happening that are changing people's lives forever. I just thought that was really, really interestingly done. The way this book looks at religion as well was very interesting. I think basically what I wanted to say about Clear was that it was just great. It's very short, but it's poignant and clever and engaging and lovely. And it feels weird to call a book lovely that is quite sad and dark in places, but I just thought it was so good, and it was a great reading experience. I read it sort of like on audiobook in 2 sittings, like while doing housework and going to the gym, and it was just such a lovely reading experience. So I really recommend Clear. It was great. And now let's talk about Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. So I listened to this also on audiobook. Both of these books worked really well on audio, and I would especially recommend listening to Glorious Exploits on audiobook. Like, while I loved listening to the audiobook of Clear, I feel like I would have got everything I got out of Clear in the same way if I had read it on the page, whereas I feel like Glorious Exploits, my reading experience was really enriched by reading the audiobook, which is narrated by the author himself as well, in a really wonderful way. Glorious Exploits is so good. I know I already said this when I filmed my Walter Scott Prize long list reaction video, because I finished it halfway through February, but oh, it was so good. You should all read Glorious Exploits. I thought it was such an original, clever, fun, powerful, complex, wonderful work of historical fiction, and just like one of the best historical fiction books I'd ever read, like hands down. Glorious Exploits is set in ancient Sicily. I think it's 412 BC, following a failed invasion attempt from Athens. The quarries of Syracuse in Sicily are now filled with Athenian prisoners of war who have basically been left to rot. They are given some food, but really hardly any, and they are left in sort of terrible conditions. And we are following 2 out-of-work Sicilian potters who, in order to kind of pass the time, spend lots of time looking at the Athenian prisoners of war. These 2 men are called Lampo and Gelin. Lampo is the narrator of the novel. It's told in first person. And Gelon is obsessed with Athenian theatre, and especially with the playwright Euripides. He decides that they are going to put on a play of Medea, using the Athenian prisoners of war as actors. They basically bribe the prisoners to be their actors by giving them extra food, which they smuggle past the guards. So there's obviously a kind of very complicated power dynamic at play here from the beginning, and everything kind of goes on from there. And it is just fantastic. The book doesn't necessarily go in the directions you expect it to go, and I just thought it was absolutely superbly done. There are so many things about Glorious Exploits that I loved. One thing I definitely thought was fantastically done is the kind of way language is used in this novel. So it is set in ancient Sicily, but Ferdia Lennon is an Irish writer, and the book is written in a very Irish style. The slang, the language, and the turn of phrase is all very Irish. And that is one of the reasons why I really recommend listening to the audiobook, probably especially if you're not Irish yourself, because I think hearing the book in Ferdia Lennon's accent is really worthwhile. Also, the Athenians all speak in English accents, and you probably wouldn't have that in your head necessarily if you were reading the book. And I think it's a really great decision for lots of reasons. It's not like they're speaking English. So if you're writing a novel in English about ancient Sicily, then why shouldn't the variety of the English language they speak be an Irish one? Also, obviously, Sicily is an island off the mainland, so I thought that worked quite well as well. And I feel like by giving the characters a voice that is very specific, but not to the specific time in which the book is set, I thought just added like a real naturalness to the narrative style in a way that is really, really effective. Glorious Exploits has a lot of really, really interesting themes. One big theme within the book is kind of power. As I said, you have the very complicated power dynamic because the Athenian prisoners of war, they're not like forced exactly to be actors in this play, but they know that they're all dying, and that they will die faster without extra food. And if they act in this play, they are given extra food. So they kind of are forced. And the very messy power dynamics at work there are so interestingly drawn, especially because one of the Athenian prisoners of war who they recruit as an actor did actually used to be an actor. And you can tell that he does love theatre and he loves acting, but he is still being coerced into doing this, kind of. Meanwhile, Lampo is falling in love with a woman who serves at his local bar, and she is a slave. She is owned by the person who runs the bar, and Lampo therefore knows that the relationship between them, if there can be a relationship between them, is always going to be unequal, because is she spending time with him because she likes him or because her owner says she is allowed to? Is she spending time with him because she cares about him or because she feels like if Lampo loves her enough, he might help her become free? And the messy power dynamics of that as well, I thought were really interestingly looked at. Lampo and Gellon themselves are not powerful people within the society that they live in. They are out of work potters with very little money, and they feel miles and miles away from the aristocrats, the aristos as Lampo calls them, who are so much more important and so much wealthier within Sicily. And so in a way, Lampo is holding on to any little scrap of power he can get, and the fact that he has so little power in his own society, but then in the quarries where he is free and the Athenians are not, he has a position of power. That is such a complicated power dynamic. I also feel like the book looks really powerfully at kind of war and violence and how war causes people to dehumanize the opposition. The Athenians invaded Sicily, and therefore the Sicilians view the Athenians as the enemy and no longer as human because of this. And the way that lasts even after the Athenians are defeated, and the way that is explored in the book, is so horrible but so fantastically drawn. I also feel like the characterization was just like superb. Lampo is not always that likable. Like, he's so frustrating and like infuriating, because at times he is nice and he's trying, but he so often lets himself down, and he's also like completely tactless. Like, he often says things and you're like, why, Lampo, why would you say that? And I feel like it would have been easy to write this book with a very different narrator who would have been more likable, but it wouldn't have been so good, because actually the complexities and messiness of Lampo was just so important to the book and worked so well. And his sort of arc, I suppose, over the course of the book and the way we see him change and grow, I thought was done so well. And I thought Gellon was really well drawn too, as were all the rest of the characters in the book. And overall, I just thought Glorious Exploits was incredible. It is simultaneously both very funny and like utterly devastating. And bits of it are like so grim, but also it's so good. Like, it's so good. I've been talking for 45 minutes about 2 books, so I think it's probably time that I wrap up this video. I just really wanted to recommend both Glorious Exploits and Clear. They are fantastic novels. Very excited so far of the 2 books I've read from the Walter Scott Prize longlist. Both of them were amazing. So I'm excited to keep reading with the rest of the longlist and bring you some more review videos. And yeah, I really recommend both of these 2 books. I thought they were great. Very different works of historical fiction. Very different feels to them, and obviously looking at very different time periods in different ways. But they were both just fantastic and so engaging to read, so I just really recommend both of them. And yeah, that is it for me for today. Thank you very much for watching this video. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read either of these books and what you thought of them. Otherwise, that's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.